what we are discussing today basically is the negotiation going on in the U.S. House of Senate on how to go ahead with the deal with Iran, the nuclear deal with Iran. So I'm going to start with Blaise. The critics say that the terminology that President Obama is using for this deal is just an agreement and not a treaty. Is it just a matter of issue of semantics, or is it the way for Mr. Obama to bypass the Congress?
Well, the difference between a treaty and an agreement, executive agreement, does matter. It's more than semantics. It involves the constitutional powers of Congress to opine on the deal. But it's ultimately up to President Obama to decide what it falls under and his lawyers. And so I don't think the constitutional question is what's important here. It's really a question of Congress's role in even making this deal a possibility. So what has brought, I think everybody agrees, Iran to the table to negotiate with the United States is a long string of sanctions that have been imposed over the last several years, some of them by executive order in the president, but most of them imposed by Congress. And what Iran is looking for in this deal in return for nuclear concessions is the lifting of those sanctions. And since Congress is the one who created those sanctions, for them to be fully lifted, Congress is going to have to act. And if Congress is going to act to lift sanctions that the president agreed to lift, it makes simple sense that Congress should also get a say in whether the deal that the president negotiates is a good one or not.
So, Tom, what is your take on this? Do you think this it is not an issue of semantic? Basically, it's the way that Mr. Obama wants to have the least amount of obstacle from the Congress, or there's something behind it?
I mean, I think Congress is seeking a role for itself, and I agree with Blaise that the appropriate role for Congress is the removal or the non-removal of sanctions, because that's Congress's main role. Mm-hmm. And very rightly, Congress helped bring Iran to the negotiating table through the sanctions. And so it is up to Congress at some point to remove the sanctions. I don't agree with the criticism that Obama has been trying to avoid Congress. I think the administration has been briefing Congress all along, has been involving Congress all along, but the appropriate role for Congress is not to approve or disapprove the deal. To me, that's an overreach of Congress. The appropriate role for Congress is overseeing the deal once it's done, because Congress does not negotiate agreements with foreign governments. That's the president's role. So let the president do that, bring the agreement back, then it's up to Congress to decide when and how to remove the sanctions.
You know, I'd point out on this that the Obama administration has really liked to side on the side of error in getting congressional approval for a lot of its actions. When you think back to the status of forces agreement with Iraq and the possibility that U.S. forces would be stationed there beyond 2010, the president sought a role for Congress to approve that deal. When you think about the red line that he set with Syria for Assad not using chemical weapons, when he was debating whether to act once Assad crossed that red line and used military force, he said, I want Congress to weigh in on this. And on some of the most momentous national security decisions he's made, he said Congress should have a role. And this being the most momentous national security decision of all, to now say we don't think Congress gets to have a role in looking at this deal is a little strange given his past stance. And I would add, you know, if we learned anything from the 2003 invasion of Iraq, it was that we need to have as vigorous and robust a public debate as we possibly can on momentous national security decisions. And I think this is probably going to be the biggest one since that 2003 vote. And I think making sure that it's a decision not taken just by the executive branch, but one in which Congress is involved, has public hearings, gets to discuss the deal, gets to listen to its merits, is very important for U.S. democracy. In fact, I'd go on to say one of the issues, I think, is that we have disagreements between the U.S. and Iran about what exactly has been agreed to so far. But if you look at the Iranian description of the framework agreement that was agreed to several weeks ago, it in fact says that the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, is going to decide whether to accept the additional protocol, so additional inspections to put on by the IAEA. And so I think the idea that the deal includes a role for the Iranian parliament but not the U.S. Congress is somewhat strange to me, that we're going to celebrate Iranian democracy such as it is but not so much U.S. democracy.
Yeah, I would just say that I think it's a myth that there's no role for the U.S. Congress. There's an important role for the U.S. Congress, which is to deal with sanctions. Congress will decide whether to remove the sanctions or not. That's an essential role for Congress to play, and that's Congress's constitutional role.
Basically, you mentioned the Syrian issue. Okay, around 2 years ago, as you said, when President Assad used the chemical weapon, President Obama did say that U.S. is going to get involved, but he fell short of that promise and said that I need the congressional approval. Now, with the Iran deal, formation of the Iran deal, and we reached that 2nd of April, the framework. Now, my question to Tom is that why is there a contradiction between the stance that President took then, wanting to involve the Congress in that Syrian issue, and now he wants the least amount of congressional playing the role in this deal?
I guess I would disagree. I mean, it's not the least amount of role. I mean, Congress will have a major role to play in this deal through the Corker-Cardin legislation. But even without that, again, the sanctions cannot be fully withdrawn without Congress weighing in. That's a huge role, and I would go back to the Syrian case as well. Many people want this agreement with Iran to be a treaty. The agreement with Syria to remove its chemical weapons was not a treaty. I mean, most of the agreements that the executive makes are non-binding political agreements. That's how 90% of the White House's work gets done. And that's the way things work in Washington. If everything was a treaty, we would never get anything done. Okay, so neither one of those situations, Iran or Syria, were treaties. And I think Congress will have an important role to play in the Iran debate through the Corker legislation, but even without that, through the consideration of sanctions removal.
Okay. So nowadays we have this issue that the Iranians and even Mr. Zarif raised it when he was in New York, the issue of removing of the sanctions. Iranians want it to be lifted as soon as the agreement is signed. The U.S. says it's a gradual thing. Now, once the deal is done, if the president was not able to fulfill the agreement he signed, because of the obstacle from the Congress, would it ostracize the U.S. image internationally? And what could President do if the Congress musters 67 votes in the Senate? Blaise?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to note that even all of the congressional sanctions that are in place on Iran contain a provision that allows the president to waive those sanctions for national security reasons for up to 6 months at a time. And so it's not that Congress has to act to get rid of the sanctions because the president can sort of keep getting rid of them. It's that for them to be lifted wholly, the Congress would have to act. And so to get a long-term sustainable deal, I think, especially considering that President Obama is going to leave office in a little under 2 years, you would eventually want Congress to act. And so first of all, the worry isn't about whether Congress has to act to lift sanctions. It's that the president could go ahead and start lifting sanctions without Congress's approval in the first place, which is why I think you're seeing Congress want to pass legislation now that will create a mechanism to ensure that they have a vote. And to ensure that the president can't take action on lifting sanctions before they've had a chance to review any deal. That being said, I think there's going to be a tough situation in which the P5+1, the international powers, have agreed to a deal. The president and the other members of the P5+1 take it to the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council will probably approve that deal, lifting multilateral sanctions. And then it'll be up to Congress whether it wants to stick with US unilateral sanctions or not. I think in that case, you will have a lot of pressure on the Congress to approve a deal and to lift sanctions, because otherwise the U.S. will be seen as the one that's breaking the treaty or not letting it be imposed and being the one that's being difficult, which is, I think, also why it's terribly important to have the debate now and to have conversations about what is a good deal and not a bad deal now, because after the fact, after there's already a deal, Congress will really pretty much be strong-armed by the president and by international opinion to go along with it.
And what's your take on it?
I would say that once the deal is done is the appropriate time for Congress to weigh in, and they will. And then we'll know the answer to some of these key questions. For example, when do the sanctions get lifted temporarily by the president? And yes, there are different interpretations of the agreement that was reached on April 2. Iran says the sanctions will be removed immediately upon signing. The United States says sanctions will only be lifted once Iran has taken various key steps pursuant to the agreement. I think there's a way to get to a middle ground on this. Possibly Iran might start implementing some of the key aspects of the agreement in advance. In other words, to get a head start. So if these things, say, will take 3 to 4 months to do, if they start soon, it might only take 1 or 2 months after the agreement is signed to get them done. So it's possible that within a month or two after the signing, you could have sanctions relief. But I think in some ways the pressure or the onus is on Iran to start taking those steps as soon as possible if they really want very quick sanctions relief.
This Corker-Cardin bill, which is being debated, what the Obama administration sees interesting in this bill is that basically the rationale behind it is the disapproval of the Congress on the agreement with Iran and not the other way around, an approval. Right. So why is it, what is the rationale behind this kind of?
Well, it was very important to the White House that Congress not be able to stop this deal, right? And that's in fact why you have White House approval of the current version of the Corker Amendment, is that it wouldn't stop the deal. It gives Congress an oversight role, which Congress very much wanted. It gives Congress oversight procedures. It slows down the process and lets Congress weigh in. But Congress cannot stop this deal. Well, let me put it this way. Congress's approval is not required for the deal to move forward, right? So Congress can reject it. Obama can veto that rejection and sustain that veto, and the deal goes through. So Congress does not have to positively approve the deal, and that is why the White House is willing to accept it.
Do you agree with the rationale?
That is, well, I think it's important to note that what the deal does is it actually creates 2 legislative vehicles once a deal is reached that are introduced in both the House and the Senate. One would be a motion of approval and one would be a motion of disapproval, and Congress would vote on both and see which one gets the most votes. The reason that some people are talking about the difference between a treaty and an agreement is constitutionally, a treaty requires 67 votes, 2/3 majority, to be approved. If you don't get 2/3 of votes, it doesn't get approved. You have a similar arrangement when you're looking at nuclear agreements that the U.S. Strikes that are non-conforming, that are considered to be abnormal, like it did with India. It requires 2/3 vote by the Congress to approve those agreements. The way that this is structured, this Corker-Cardin bill, it would actually it requires 2/3 votes to disapprove. So it puts the burden of proof sort of on the other side because, as Tom said, the president could veto a motion of disapproval. And I think it's that shift between having to put a majority in order to approve versus a majority to disapprove. That is why some critics have been not very happy with the agreement being submitted, the deal being submitted as an agreement and not as a treaty.
I would just add that the legislation also allows no action to be taken. And so that's a clue as well.
Which becomes automatic.
If Congress takes no action, then the deal automatically goes into effect.
We witnessed some of the debates going on to add some amendments to this deal, some of them by the presidential hopefuls that's running. What is your take on it? Do you believe that they were like something of substance or just political, they had their own political agenda? And also I wanted to know the role that Senator Mitch McConnell played in basically wrapping up this debate.
Right. Well, I think what you'll find in the Senate is that there's bipartisan support for talking about the process. Okay, there's bipartisan support for having the Senate to play a process role in oversight and review of the Iran deal. There is no bipartisan support for killing the Iran deal. And so what we're seeing is Republican senators coming up, Senator Rubio, Senator Cotton, proposing amendments that would essentially kill the deal by adding sort of extraneous issues that they know that Iran would oppose. And so there's no bipartisan support for killing the deal at this point. And I think Majority Leader McConnell is realizing that if he wants this legislation to survive, which he does because it gives the Republicans in Congress this oversight role that they so much want, then he has to prevent these extraneous killer amendments from coming along, or else there will be no Corker bill, and the Republicans will be back to sort of square one about how do we have oversight over this agreement.
So I would fully agree with Tom's characterization of the process, and I think it's a wonderful thing to see the Senate working again, taking up amendments, having debate, hopefully passing bills in a bipartisan manner. That's a real change from what's been happening for the last 2, 3, 4 even years in the United States, and I think it's something to be celebrated. I would differ in my characterization of the amendments that have been offered. I think some might be considered to be political grandstanding and trying to win points for various constituencies. But I think to describe them as killers or to describe them as trying to sink the deal is really a bit insincere, because when you look at what's been offered, for example, Senator Rubio offered an amendment that said we will only approve a deal if the deal is the same as the framework agreement that President Obama has already said is going to be the foundation of a final deal. To think that that's a killer, to say that the president has to have a deal that's the same as what he said it's going to be, is trying to sink a deal, really seems insincere unless you already admit that the framework agreement was never going to function in the first place.
I would disagree. It's not insincere, it's tying the hands of the president. I mean, yes, they have a framework agreement, and they now need to finish that negotiation. So let them finish that negotiation without interfering with that negotiation.
And then secondly, I'd add, if you look at some of the other provisions, for example, asking that any final deal include resolution of Iran's outstanding possible military dimension of its nuclear program, something that the IAEA has been complaining about for a long time, something that the administration said should always be part of a final deal, something that the interim agreement said should be part of a final deal, and something that Iran has been blocking IAEA investigations of for a long time. I think that's an important part of any final deal. How can we have any confidence that an inspections regime is going to be full and robust if we don't know all of the things that we should be looking for, all of the research that Iran has done? And so again, I think these are important debates to be had about what the substance of a good deal is, that are important considerations about what Congress would like to see in a deal, that I think whether they're accepted in a deal or not, whether they should be part of it pragmatically for the purposes of passing a deal or not, I think they've been submitted in the genuine hope of having a robust discussion about what should be part of the nuclear negotiations.
Yeah, I would say that now we're talking about the process, not the process anymore, but the substance of the agreement, and that's inappropriate. I mean, again, Congress does not negotiate agreements with foreign governments. The president does. Let the president negotiate the agreement, bring it back to Congress, and then Congress can discuss it.
Okay. Tomorrow, Thursday, is the date that announced that they're going to do a vote on it in the Senate. Senator Cardin said that there's a possibility that it gets 90 votes now. What is your take on it? Would it be passing by that sort of majority, or would there be a possibility of a last-minute filibuster tomorrow?
Well, I think if you look historically at Iran legislation that's been taken up by Congress, often in the face of a veto threat from President Obama, it passes not just with bipartisan majorities, but overwhelming bipartisan majorities. I think the worst vote for a piece of Iran sanctions legislation was 400 to 20 in the House. It's passed as much as 99 to 1 in the Senate in the past. And so I think expecting at least 90 votes on this, especially when the White House has already signaled that it will accept a bill if it isn't amended, is really a minimum bar. I think we're going to go much higher.
I agree. I think it's going to be overwhelming support. I think any of the sort of rebellious activity has already been shut down. It's already happened. And now I think there's an emerging consensus to move ahead. Any amendments you see will be sort of non-controversial amendments. They'll deal with them rather quickly, and then the bill will pass overwhelmingly.
And would it have a smooth sail in the House of Representatives also?
I expect so. I mean, I would imagine that much as you saw in the Senate, there'll be those who wish to amend it. There will be those who wish to strengthen it. But I think we've seen a sort of bipartisan pragmatism take hold in the Congress. Among the leadership, there's a sense that the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. And you'll see similar passage, maybe not as robust in the House, but certainly with a bipartisan majority.
I agree with Blaise. I think they'll follow the Senate's lead and pass essentially whatever the Senate passes.
So if everything works fine and President has something on his desk to sign, would it strengthen his position in negotiating with Iran? Would it possibly give him a leverage on Iranian to not to sort of give them so much concession as some of the critics are saying? How would it play out?
I think it's essentially irrelevant to the negotiations with Iran. And Iran has essentially said as much. They said, we're not negotiating with the Congress, we're negotiating with President Obama and the White House. And that's the case. So, Congress can do what it wants to make itself feel good about having oversight and that kind of thing. Ultimately, this is a negotiation between the leadership of Iran, the leadership of the United States, and the other allied countries that are involved. And then whatever Congress does is really window dressing at this point.
I think that Congress would definitely like this to be used as leverage against Iran as part of the negotiating process. If you look at the way that Iran negotiates with the United States, it uses various elements of its regime as playing good cop, bad cop. You have Foreign Minister Zarif, you have President Rouhani, who present themselves as the moderates ready to strike a deal, but always saying, we have a hardline constituency back home that we need to meet. You have Supreme Leader Khamenei, who's always issuing new red lines and saying, we can't agree to this, we can't agree to this, we can't agree to this. And it would make sense for the United States and the president to have the same sort of negotiating tactics, saying, look, I really want to deal with you guys, I really want to get this done, but I have this crazy Congress back home that I really need to deal with, and are now going to have to approve a deal, so you're going to have to throw me a few bones. But I agree with Tom that I don't see that being the president's strategy going forward.
What sort of effect the polls have on the psyche of the Congress, whether the Senate or the House of Representatives, once the deal is made with Iran, whether like approximately before the 30th of June or whatever, when the deal is actually in the hands, what do the polls play in the minds of the Congress? We have the one, for example, that I have here is the NBC polls showing that 67% of the people were asked saying that there's Iran may not abide by the terms of the agreement. Now, when that sort of polls come out, what sort of effect does it have on the Congress?
I think the polls are telling sort of different things. On the one hand, the polls say that a strong majority support diplomacy with Iran as opposed to a war. But they also show that the public distrusts Iran. But I think the overall message of that is, let's try diplomacy. What's interesting is that you certainly don't see that message translating into what the Republican majority is doing in Congress, which is very much pushing against diplomacy. And so, from that perspective, I don't see public opinion playing much of a role in what the majority in Congress is doing. But it's certainly something that President Obama can use to say, hey, what I'm doing is popular, if not with the Congress, at least with the general public. And that's important because my assumption is that the Republican majority in Congress will reject the Iran deal, which will be vetoed and then sustained. So there will be a deal, but Congress will be on record rejecting it. But that'll be very much the Republican majority of Congress being against it, and you'll have public opinion in general being supportive of the deal.
Okay.
I would flip the question and say this is an important place where our nation's leaders should not be led by the polls, but try to lead the public. I don't know how many people in our general public are going to be capable of, even if we get a published deal, which there's been claims that we might not actually see what the deal is, are going to be able to look at the number of centrifuges, the enrichment level, how much gets shipped out, how much stays, what the inspections regime is, parse the details of the additional protocol to the IAEA, and determine whether this is a good deal or a bad deal, which is precisely why Congress has a role not just in lifting sanctions, but in debating, reviewing, having hearings, hearing testimony, getting briefed on, listening to experts to try to determine what is in the deal, what would it do, how would it impact Iran's nuclear program, and translating that to the public. Because certainly from the president, you're going to hear this is a great deal, and maybe it is, but there should be some sort of objective review of that. There should be some national debate about it. And so I think Congress's role here is not to be led by the polls, but really to inform public opinion in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to our program, Horizon. It was wonderful having you and listening to your opinions. It was a pleasure hosting you.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure being here. Thank you very much.